It's late. Screen glow on your face. You type in the group chat, then watch 3 dots disappear, and nothing. At work, you pitch an idea. Later, someone repeats it and gets the nod. In your own family, you keep the peace. Therefore, you keep quiet. Therefore, they assume you're fine. Invisible is not a superpower. It's a slow eraser. And when life erases you long enough, a question starts scratching the door. Does God hear the rejected? Pause. Before we go ancient, stay here. Maybe you're the older child who stepped back so a younger one could shine, but stepping back became your forever posture. Maybe you're the immigrant trying to pronounce courage in a strange accent. Maybe you prayed like it mattered, and the only reply was a clock that wouldn't move. The silence feels like judgment. But what if it's set up? What if the story we're about to enter is not a museum piece, but a mirror? And the first thing it reflects is your ache to be heard. We're following a boy whose life is named before it unfolds. Ishmael. God hears. That's his literal name stamped on a birth certificate no one in his house asked for. Great, except most of his screen time will look like the opposite. He isn't the heir everyone's waiting for. Therefore, he becomes the shadow in his own story. He's born into a triangle no geometry teacher can fix. He grows up in the posture of being almost chosen, almost celebrated, almost secure. Adheres, but do we? Here's our project for the next hour. We are going to hunt the moments when this kid is least heard at home at a feast in a desert, where the air itself feels loud, and we will test the name. Names in the Bible are not hashtags, they're mission statements. If God hears is true, it must hold under heat, not just in a lullaby. So we'll slow the emotional clock when the water skin empties. We'll listen to a mother who doesn't have the luxury of pretty prayers. We'll watch promises collide like weather fronts over one household. 2 rules while we travel. First, fair use and fair heart. We'll quote a few anchor lines for bearings, but mostly we'll paraphrase, paint, and apply. Second, this is for all of us. No doctrinal knife fights, no us versus them. The point is not to win an argument. The point is to find water. And just so you know where we're going, the boy who is pushed out will become a man who builds outposts. The one the party ignored will father princes who set up tents across the map. The rejected will be remembered, not by rumor, by God. Frame break. Why start with rejection? 'Cause rejection edits your theology. When you're celebrated, you assume God is loud. When you're sidelined, you start to wonder if he mutes himself around you. But the Ishmael story insists on a reversal. God is often loudest at the edge. Not the conference room, but the wilderness. Not the toast at the feast, but the quiet sob 100 yards away. If that's true, then your edge is not an exile from God, it's the address he asks you to share. So here is the tension we'll carry. Scene to scene, people can overlook you. Systems can mislabel you. Even a holy household can make choices that move you to the margins. Therefore, you may start to believe your worth is a percentage of someone else's promise. But the God who names a boy he hears will not file your life under miscellaneous. He will find you by a spring. He will speak future into the space where you only hear your heartbeat. He will open eyes to a well that was there the whole time. Let's begin. Takeaway. When you feel erased, act like one who is heard. Name your ache out loud to God today and choose one small move towards someone else nobody hears. Night after night, the tent breathes with 2 people trying not to break. Sarai counts moons like unpaid bills. She knows the math of disappointment by heart, how long hope takes to climb, how fast it falls. She loves Abram, therefore she watches his face when he looks at the stars, wonders if he's still picturing a future with tiny footprints in the dust, or if the promise has become a polite myth. You nod at, but don't invite to dinner. The body keeps its own calendar. Hers has been saying not yet for years. Not yet becomes not ever. Not ever becomes a plan. So she drafts one. If the door won't open through me, therefore we try the side gate. Hagar. Egyptian, younger, capable, A servant, yes, but also a woman with a name, a history, a laugh that sometimes floats over the morning bread. In their world, this workaround isn't scandal. It's strategy. You use the tools you have. Sarai stands in the doorway of the idea and rehearses the speech like a hostage negotiator with her own longing. Go into her, she will say. Not to displace herself, to secure a future, to protect a promise, to quiet the ache that keeps turning over in the night like a hot stone. Abram listens. He is the man of altars and long roads. Therefore he has learned how to wait. But he is also a husband whose patience now rubs against his wife's tears. He wants to comfort her, therefore he consents. The decision is not flashy. No music swells. Papers aren't signed. Hands are. A life veers quietly. What begins as mercy to Sarai will become a mirror for them all. Conception is not a statistic. It is a change in how eyes look at you. Hagar feels the shift first. The tent smells sharper. The ground seems steadier. Her own hand rests on her belly as if to confirm that she is no longer a hallway. She is a room. She is still a servant, but the household's axis tilts an inch in her direction. And inches matter in houses like this. Sarai sees the tilt and feels the floor sliding out from under her. There's an expression only those who have tasted deferred hope can recognize, a smile that's really a shield. She tries it. It breaks. The text says, contempt surfaces. Therefore the house fractures. Contempt is a quiet weapon. It doesn't need speeches. It only needs a half-second longer, on the glance a small exhale that says, I carry what you could not. Hagar doesn't say those words, but Sarai hears them anyway. Sarai doesn't assign extra chores because she wants to be cruel. She assigns them because control is the only thing that seems loyal. Abram, queued between two storms, he cannot command, tries to be Switzerland, therefore he becomes absent. Neutrality in a family ache often feels like neglect. The affliction escalates. Sarai's hands get busier. Hagar's back gets tighter. Words become sharper, and the corners of the tent crowd in. Hagar's breaths start to count distance, how far to the edge of camp, how many steps until the next mirage. She did not audition for this triangle. She was volunteered. Does that make her less responsible for her posture? Maybe. Maybe not. But responsibility matters less than reality. When your chest is tight and the ground keeps calling you away. One morning, reality wins. She runs. Picture the decision not as a sprint, but as a series of small exits. First, she leaves the chore for later. Then she walks past the place where Sarai usually calls her name and doesn't stop. Then the last tent flap, then the last fence post, then the road that stops being a road and starts being an argument with the sun. Every step is a sentence. I am not staying to be erased. I am not staying to be a vessel and a target. I am not staying to watch two people negotiate my body like a shipping route. The wilderness of Shur is not a vacation. It is a dare. Hagar takes it because sometimes the only way to remember you are a person is to walk where no one's idea of you can keep up. Frame break. Whose pain are we supposed to sympathize with here? Yes, the answer is yes. Sarai's barrenness is not a plot device. It is a wound with rituals. Abram's hesitation is not failure. It is the fatigue of leadership in a fragile promise. Hagar's posture is not pure humility or pure pride. It is a human trying to stand upright in a house built for someone else's future. If you choose one to defend and the others to dismiss, you will shrink the story until it fits your argument and lose its power to change you. Back to the road. The desert has a way of stripping honorifics. Out here, nobody is mistress, nobody is handmaid, nobody is patriarch. There is sun, there is thirst, there is a woman with a future pressing against her ribcage, and a past that won't hold her. She stops by a spring water, always writes footnotes into the desert's hard text. She drinks, she breathes, she calculates. She imagines telling this child one day where their story turned. She prepares to keep moving because survival without a map is still survival. What she doesn't know is that the wilderness is not empty. Someone is already looking for her. But that is the next scene. Takeaway shortcuts Rama's control, but often produce collateral damage. Before you fix a longing, name it to God and to someone safe, then choose the next faithful step, not the fastest one. The sun is a hammer. The road is an argument. Hagar reaches the spring on the way to Egypt and drinks the way you breathe after crying short surprised, like your own throat is a stranger. She is running from a house that turned into a maze. She is running with a child who didn't ask to be a statement. She is running because staying felt like vanishing in slow motion. The desert does not flatter her. It tells the truth. Out here, status peels off like old bark. Out here, you are not titles. You are thirst pulse direction. Then a voice finds her. It is not the voice of a caravan, not the bark of a guard, not Sarai's clipped syllables. It is the voice that makes a wilderness feel smaller. Where have you come from? And where are you going, not because he needs coordinates, but because questions sew ribs back together? Hagar answers with the only sentence she owns, "I'm running from my mistress." The question opens space. The answer fills it with ache. The voice does not scold her for honesty. He dignifies it. He sees her, therefore. He speaks to her future. The instruction is hard. Return live under authority again. The promise is harder to believe. The child inside you will become a multitude. You will call him Ishmael, God hears, because heaven has listened to your distress. Not your performance, your distress. The prophecy sketches a boy unbroken by harness, a wild donkey of a man, not tamed, not easy, dwelling alongside his brothers with a fierce independence. It sounds like trouble to comfortable people. It sounds like oxygen to a woman who has only been useful when useful to others. Hagar does something theologians will write papers about and mothers will understand in a second. She names God. Not because he lacked a name, but because she needed a way to carry what happened. El Roy, the God who sees me. She marks the place with a name too well of the living one who sees. Because places where God meets you deserve their own vocabulary. She wipes her face, steadies her steps, and points her feet back toward the house that hurt her, because vision without obedience is just a warm feeling. She goes back with the same body and a different center. Frame break return is a complicated word. If you're in danger, return is not the command. Safety is. Hagar's return is not a universal rule. It is a particular path under a particular promise with God as witness. Do not weaponize her obedience against someone else's safety. The transferable truth is not go back to where you were harmed. It's this: when God locates you, he can lead you, even if that leading moves through places you would not have chosen. Being seen is not always a shortcut around pain. Sometimes it is provision inside it. Notice the order. First, seen, then heard, then instructed, then promised. Identity first, assignment next. When you are treated like an instrument, people reverse the order assignment. First identity, later, if ever. God puts dignity before duty. He gives Hagar a future to mother, toward not just a task to grind through. He binds her son's name to his own attention, so that every time she calls Ishmael across a courtyard or a campsite, she is preaching to herself, God here adheres. The name becomes a liturgy she can throw like a rope across the years. She returns. The house hasn't changed. Sarai still measures silence by the jarful. Abram still holds promises like fragile pottery. But Hagar carries a well inside now. She knows the desert is not empty. She knows the living one sees. She knows her boy's name is a sentence heaven wrote first. Therefore she can do the ordinary sacred work, cooking, cleaning, waiting, steady breathing, without surrendering the story to despair. Therefore the pregnancy continues. Therefore the child is born. And the boy's first cry in that tent answers the question baked into his name. Years will pass. Another baby will arrive, impossible and laughed for. A feast will be thrown, and laughter will turn sharp. Collision is coming. But don't rush there yet. Let this moment finish its work. A woman ran into the wilderness to escape contempt. God met her, named her story, and sent her back with a promise that fit inside a cradle. You are seen is not a theory anymore. It is a well with a name and a child with a future. If you feel anonymous, learn from Hagar. Mark the place where God met you, even if it's a mental address. Speak the name He gave you. Walk the path He sets, not the one fear scripts. You are not the sum of other people's plans. You are the one the living one sees and the one He hears. Takeaway. God's order is dignity before duty. He sees you, therefore. He hears you, therefore. He guides you. Name your well today. Write down where God met you, and let that identity lead your next obedience. Dawn stretches thin over the camp, and the old man walks the boundary lines like he has every morning since Hope first learned his name. He runs a hand along a tent rope, checks a tether, counts animals he long ago stopped naming. He is Abram, the name that has carried him through border checks and famine and the strange laughter of neighbors who think promise is just another word for delusion. He prays with the slowness of someone who has burned through adrenaline and superstition and is now down to bone faith. He is almost 100. His wife is almost 90. The body keeps receipts. The promise is still outstanding. The encounter comes like weather. Not a philosophy, a presence. A covenant is cut deeper than optimism. It's a binding of future to fidelity. Names change because identities do. Abram becomes Abraham, father of a multitude. Sarai becomes Sarah, princess, a title that sounds ridiculous until you remember that God doesn't ask your circumstances for permission to rename you. The sign is given a mark in the body that says, "We belong, therefore, we will be different." It's not a badge for bragging. It's a scar of belonging. But listen to the father heart inside the ceremony. Abraham bows to the divine plan, therefore he asks a human question. What about Ishmael? He does not tuck the boy under the sand of silence. He brings him into the conversation with God because love refuses to treat children like appendices to theology. The answer is layered yes and no, without cruelty. Yes, Ishmael will be blessed a future, a nation, princes on the map. No, the covenant line, the lane that carries this particular promise to bless all families, will run through a son yet to come through Sarah. Therefore distinction, not dismissal. That sentence is harder than it reads. Humans hear "not this lane" and translate it as "not loved." We are wired for zero sum. If Isaac carries the covenant, therefore, Ishmael must carry rejection. But heaven's arithmetic runs surplus. Different assignments do not measure worth. They design purpose. Abraham receives it with the ache of a dad and the steadiness of a patriarch. He doesn't argue the map of God's future, but he holds tight to the boy standing right in front of him, and God meets him there. Yes, I have heard you about Ishmael. A promise finally puts on skin. Isaac arrives like morning after a decade of midnight, and laughter echoes through the tents, not the brittle kind people use to defend themselves, but the kind that makes neighbors lean in and grin without knowing why. Sarah laughs and doesn't apologize. She names the boy. He laughs as if to tattoo joy on time itself. For months, the camp lives slower, softer. Abraham's shoulders drop a fraction. Hagar cooks, cleans, mothers. Ishmael watches the new child who has rearranged the air and tries to decode what this means for the story that used to center him only when adults weren't looking. Time does its faithful work. The child grows. Milk becomes bread. The day comes to wean Isaac, a ceremony in their world, not a calendar footnote. The camp strings garlands, slaughters animals, pours drink. A weaning feast is more than a toddler milestone. It is a public declaration that the boy has crossed from fragile to sturdy. Music rises, plates clatter, blessings pile up like cushions. Abraham's eyes shine in a way Hagar has learned to recognize a father's relief loosening into laughter. For just one afternoon, the promise is visible, and nobody is pretending otherwise. Then a second laugh cuts across the first. The text uses the same root tshk, laughter play mocking, therefore, interpreters argue. Was Ishmael playing with a child, a teenager goofing with a toddler? Was he mocking the celebration, puncturing the mood? Was he, God forbid, positioning himself as heir in a public gesture Sarah could not stomach? We don't get a screenshot. We get a verb with edges. What we do see is Sarah's face tighten. Old ache is fluent. It needs no translator. A sound that might be harmless to one ear detonates in another that has lived too long with delay. The line between threat and tease collapses. She will not let ambiguity raise her son. She finds Abraham. She does not whisper. Pain rarely drafts policy gently. Drive out the slave woman and her son. She demands language that distances to survive. Not Hagar, not Ishmael. Titles, roles, labels that make the necessary sound less cruel. Her logic is simple: inheritance cannot be shared. Not this one. If they remain, the boy of laughter will grow up inside a permanent triangle, and triangles stab children as they stretch. Sarah has waited decades for this child. She will not allow a teen with a complicated laugh to live close enough to cut the future by accident. Abraham is pierced. The camp noise goes muffled like a party underwater. He hears two laughs ringing in his head, the one that filled the tent when Isaac arrived, and the one he remembers from Ishmael's first cry. He loves both sons. Therefore the math does not resolve. He can't choose a child like you, choose a cloak. The heart doesn't sort by covenant lanes. But hearts live inside bodies, and bodies live inside homes, and homes require decisions. He does what he has learned to do. When the map folds over itself, he asks God. Frame break. Some of us will try to decide who is right here so the story can play cleanly. Don't. This is not a courtroom transcript. It is a family under pressure. Sarah's fear is not baseless. Ancient homes guarded inheritance like cities guarded gates. Hagar's dignity is not disposable. She and her son did not become less human because a new promise arrived. Ishmael is not a cartoon antagonist. He is a teenager interpreting adult weather with a teenager's tools. If the scene forces you to pick one and scorn the rest, the problem is not the scene. It's our appetite for easy heroes. God's answer to Abraham will come with layers in the next part. But pause here at the demand. The weaning feast is still humming. Children chase each other with sticky hands. Servants clear platters with practiced choreography. A drum thumps. In the middle of it, a sentence slams the table and splits the room, send them away. Joy has flushed old wounds to the surface, and the household must decide whether celebration can coexist with careful, costly separation. Not all separations are betrayals. Some are boundaries that keep a promise from being bled dry by years of tension. Abraham stands between two laughs and one demand. He is the hinge of a door that is about to swing painfully wide. The man who once left a country for a voice will now have to let a son walk into a wilderness and trust that the same voice carries that boy's name in his mouth. But we are not there yet. Right now, we are at a party where a mother's protectiveness and a father's tenderness collide, and nobody knows how to keep every plate in the air without breaking a heart. Takeaway moments of joy can expose old wounds. When celebration and fear collide, refuse. Snap judgments, seek God, set wise boundaries, and protect the promise without dehumanizing the people. The sky is still blue-black when Abraham lights the first coal. He doesn't want the camp to see him the way he feels torn cloth frayed edge, so he moves like farmers move before headlines can catch them. He checks the skin tests, the cork weighs the bread in his palm, the way a father weighs time and comes up short. The night's chill is still stitched into the air, but the heat he fears is already walking toward them from the east. He remembers 2 laughs, 1 demand, and the God who spoke into both. He is grieved, therefore he prays. He prays, therefore he obeys. The instruction was as clear as it was costly. Listen to Sarah send them out. Trust me with the boy whose name is a sentence about my ears. Abraham has learned that obedience is not the opposite of love. Obedience is love refusing to worship proximity. He can hold Isaac's lane without hating Ishmael's. He can honor Sarah's fear without collapsing Hagar's dignity. Therefore he wakes early. Therefore he packs quietly. Therefore he walks toward Hagar's tent with hands that will not stop shaking. Hagar steps into the threshold and knows. Mothers read weather in faces. The bundle, the water, the hour. These are not errands. These are endings. Ishmael, taller, now stands behind her with the posture of someone who wants to be a shield and is still mostly a boy. Abraham exhales a sentence that begins in apology and ends in benediction. He cannot say everything, so he gives what he can, provisions, direction, and a look that will have to last longer than it should. The old man who once left his father's house, because God said go, now releases his firstborn, because God said let go. They walk to the edge of camp together. Some goodbyes happen in a thunderclap. This one happens in a hush. A dog trots unconcerned. A servant unties a knot and looks away. Abraham lifts the skin again as if more checking could make it bottomless. He places it on Hagar's shoulder. He places his hand on Ishmael's head. He does not bless the boy despite the promise. He blesses the boy because promise and blessing are not enemies. Then the math of feet takes over, and the ones he loves become smaller and smaller inside the morning. Frame break. Obedience is not a mood, it is a muscle. We want it to feel noble. It often feels like nausea. We imagine that if God really spoke, the next step would roll downhill. Sometimes God speaks, and the next step is uphill, with a backpack full of your own longing. Abraham's grief does not negate his faith. It flavors it. He is not over the boy. He is surrendered. The difference is the difference between throwing something away and placing it into hands that can hold it better. He turns back through the camp slower than he left. Everything is the same, and nothing is. The rope still hums in the breeze. The animals still complain. Sarah, awake now, holds Isaac close like the promise might slip, if not cradled. Abraham sits finely like a man who has finished a task that did not have a better option. He chooses to trust not the optics, but the voice, because God did not wash his hands of Hagar and Ishmael. He named the boy for his hearing and will answer his own name. There is a tenderness tucked inside this hard dawn that we must not miss. God does not outsource the pain. He meets it on both roads. He speaks to the father's fear so the father can release. He will speak to the mother's despair so she can survive. He honors the covenant through Isaac without deleting the boy who will learn to draw a bow in the desert. Heaven can walk 2 paths at once. Abraham cannot. Therefore, he does the one thing given to him today and stops pretending he can be God for anyone. The sun lifts. Work resumes. Somewhere beyond the last fence post, a woman counts steps. A boy rehearses bravery, and a well waits to be seen. The hardest goodbyes are not the end of a story. They are the place where one promise hands another to God. Takeaway. When love and obedience collide, do the one faithful step God has made clear and entrust the rest. Release what you cannot carry and keep praying like God still hears the name. Heat climbs the backs of stones like a living thing. The horizon waves. The skin is lighter than it should be. Hagar knows that terrible weightlessness that means there is nothing left to pour. She tips it anyway because mothers tip hope long after physics has finished speaking. A dry sound answers. Ishmael's lips are the color of dusk. Steps have turned into sways, sways into pauses, pauses into sitting. The wilderness of Beersheba does not negotiate. When water runs out, therefore options do too. She makes a choice no mother should ever have to make. She tucks the boy under the thin mercy of a shrub and backs away the distance of a bow shot far enough not to watch his breathing grow shallow, close enough to count it anyway. "I cannot watch the boy die" is not a line she says out loud. It is the sentence her feet write in the sand. She weeps at a distance. Ishmael's throat cracks into its own sound. Two cries rise, one seasoned with adulthood's vocabulary, one raw as first light. Heaven hears one in particular. The story does not say God heard the mother, though he surely did. It says he heard the boy. Not because a mother's tears don't move him, they do, but because the promise has always wrapped itself around this child's future. The messenger calls to Hagar from the invisible place where fear thinks no voice can reach. What's wrong is not the meaning so much as "do not be afraid." The words do not refill the water's skin, they steady the hands that will. Promise follows the boy will live, he will rise, he will become a nation. Instruction follows the promise, go lift him up, take him by the hand. Divine comfort does not flatter despair, it gives you something to do. Then a sentence the desert did not see coming. God opened her eyes. It is not a conjuring trick. The well did not explode out of nothing like a magic show. It was there near enough to change the ending, hidden by panic's tunnel vision. Hagar sees it now. She runs with the speed of someone whose theology just put on legs. She fills the skin until it has honest weight again. She moves back toward the boy, with water, with words, with hands that refuse to let fear narrate the last paragraph. He drinks. Breath, once rationed, begins to stretch again. Color returns to lips. The world blooms from grayscale to sand gold. Frame break. Some of us want miracles that don't need our participation. Wake me when the well walks over here. But notice the order promise: instruction, sight, action, water. God does what only he can do. He opens eyes, and then he invites Hagar to do what only she can do. Carry the skin, lift the boy, pour. If you are waiting for a rescue that exempts you from movement, you may be waiting for a story the Bible isn't telling. Grace is not allergic to grit. Mercy loves a partner with sleeves rolled. Also notice who gets named. The angel calls her Hagar. The wilderness had tried to reduce her to role's servant exile liability. Heaven restores personhood by speaking her name. Despair anonymizes. God particularizes. In your hardest place, listen for the sound of your own name from someone who is not lost about you. That name-calling is not sentiment, it is assignment. Lift the boy, hold him by the hand. Specific verbs for a specific woman in a specific heat. The well scene is not just about survival, it is rehearsal for identity. Every time Hagar fills a skin after this, her hands will remember that first weight after emptiness. Every time Ishmael reaches for a bowstring, his muscles will remember a hand that steadied him when standing felt like a luxury. The miracle does not delete the road, it equips it. The desert doesn't turn into a garden in a minute. But there is a line now between death and tomorrow. And the line is wet. Modern echo. You've watched the battery on your phone crawl to 1% and felt your chest imitate it. You've drafted the resignation email. You've mapped the cheapest route out of a life. Then a voice that does not use your anxiety's tone says, "Don't be afraid. Get up." You look again and see an option you couldn't see 10 minutes ago. A clinic appointment opens. A neighbor knocks, a friend texts an address. A small grant is approved, a job you applied for. As Adair says, "When can you start?" The well was there. Fear hid it. Faith didn't create it. Faith found it. Hagar lifts the boy. Hands under shoulders, under futures. She does not carry him like a burden. She carries him like a promise with a pulse. Water against teeth is a sacrament in the desert. Voice against fear is too. She speaks life into a head that will soon memorize wind patterns and the language of distance. She looks out over the scrub and stone and sees not a void but a path. Survival is no longer the only verb. Becoming is next. Hold here before we roll credits on this scene. God did not shame a woman for running out of plan. He did not attach a lecture to the well. He matched his name to a boy's need and his sight to a mother's blindness and made a place for both to rise. The rejected were heard, the unseen saw, and the dying drank. If you're at the edge, this is not a museum display. It is a map. Do the next faithful thing with the well you can now see. Takeaway. At the edge of your strength, ask God to open your eyes, then move with what He shows. Promise, instruction, sight, action, water. Mercy meets you, therefore you act. Grace sustains you, therefore you continue. The desert does not hand you medals. It hands you muscles. After the well days line up like stones in a wall. Therefore Ishmael learns the grammar of survival until it sounds like his first language. Morning, check wind. Midday, track shade. Evening, mind the stars, not for poetry, but for direction. Hagar watches him lengthen calves, daring distances, shoulders taking on the shape of tasks, hands callousing into competence. A boy who once needed lifting now draws a bow and lifts his eyes to measure space, not scarcity. The bow is not a toy. It's a thesis. Pull back, hold steady, breathe. Release therefore the arrow, obeys the laws God wrote into distance. Ishmael discovers that you cannot bully a target. You must learn its patience. He misses, therefore he adjusts. He hits, therefore he respects the next shot as if it were the first. The desert becomes a teacher who gives quizzes every afternoon and fails everyone who pretends. Slowly the wilderness that almost unmade him becomes a studio where he is composed. Identity threads through daily bread. Hagar, Egyptian, by birth and memory, keeps a small museum of home inside her tent, scents recipes, a lullaby whose vowels carry Nile water. Therefore, when Ishmael is of age, she goes looking where her story began and brings back a wife from Egypt. This is not rebellion against Abraham's camp. It is a restoration of Hagar's dignity and the weaving of Ishmael's identity through a maternal lineage often asked to disappear. Sons inherit land and lanes. They also inherit horizon lines and songs. The marriage is a quiet covenant in a world that prefers noisy ones. There is no feast recorded, no list of gifts cataloged for future arguments. There are two people learning how to be faithful when faithfulness isn't trending. They will pitch tents where the wind allows and where water suggests. They will fight small fights about the proper way to pack a skin or string a line, then laugh because laughter survived the desert too. They will build the unglamorous empire of everyday meals, repairs apologies, touch silence that doesn't accuse words that don't overpromise. Frame break. We often treat outside the covenant line as outside God's care, but notice the text's stubborn refusal to do that. God was with the boy as he grew. Not in parentheses, in the sentence. Withness is not a downgrade. It is a presence that makes skill holy. Therefore, Ishmael's archery becomes more than survival. It becomes service. A good archer feeds a camp, guards a caravan, keeps predators honest. Vocation is how love puts on work clothes. Some of you learned resilience the hard way, and now use it like a weapon against softness. The desert can do that. Turn competence into contempt. Watch Ishmael resist it. The same hands that pull bowstring can carry water. The same eyes that calculate distance can recognize a neighbor's need. He thrives outside the covenant lane, but not outside the radius of promise. God's blessing doesn't need the center seat to be true. It only needs a life willing to steward what's in reach. Community happens one solved problem at a time. A rope frays on a traveler's pack. Ishmael shows a better knot. A clan argues over a path. He knows which wadi floods late and which stones hold heat longest after sunset. Hagar teaches children how to read wind on canvas, by listening to sound, not just sight. The wife from Egypt plants familiarity in foreign soil, a herb that tastes like home, a song that turns evenings kind. They do not headline history in these years. They headline kindness. Modern mirror. You didn't get the promotion. You built a business that feeds 5 families. You didn't finish the degree. You learned the code and shipped the product. You didn't get the center lane. You paved a side road people actually use. Therefore, your life is not lesser. It is local, and local is where God often hides his best work. You are not a consolation prize. You are a pillar at the edge. Do not miss the emotional maturation underneath the practical. The boy who almost died of thirst becomes a man who scans for wells instinctively for others as much as for himself. Trauma can turn people inward. Grace can turn them outward without denying the scar. Ishmael's scar is real. Therefore, his compassion is not theoretical. He knows the taste of dust when there's nothing left to swallow. He also knows the surprise weight of a refilled skin. His leadership sounds like directions to water. The scene does not crescendo to a miracle. It settles into a life. Scripture gives us no speeches here, just verbs. God was with the boy. He lived in the wilderness. He became an archer. His mother got him a wife from Egypt. Sometimes holiness is a stack of sturdy verbs. If you are addicted to spectacle, you'll read this part too fast. Slow down. This is how most promises keep breathing. Faithful, work-rooted identity, chosen family. A craft practiced with humility. Let the camera linger on one ordinary evening. Ishmael strings his bow in the blue hour. His wife needs bread. Hagar hums the lullaby that once carried a desert night and now carries a house. A wind moves the tent like a slow heartbeat. No angels appear, but presence is not absent. The man once exiled stands on his own threshold, and the wilderness nods back like 2 veterans who know something about each other that need not be said. Takeaway. Don't despise the margin. Build skill. Choose rooted relationships and serve where you stand, because God with you in the wilderness can grow a life as meaningful as any center stage miracle. Maps begin as family trees. What starts as one tent in Paran braids into cords of clans stretching across the dry ribs of the land. Ishmael becomes a headline. Many tents long, sons, chiefs, encampments, settlements, territories edged by wadis and the patient teeth of hills. He doesn't crown himself. The desert does. Communities form where wells hold, where acacia breaks the wind, where the sky remembers to become cloud. From these coordinates, influence moves like caravans, steady, deliberate, unafraid of distance. Names begin to sound like directions. Nebaioth, firstborn, wait. Kedar, flocks, dark as the goat hair tents that keep wind honest. Adbil and Mibsam Mishma and Duma Massa and Hadad Tema and Jetur Naphish and Kedema, each a stake in the earth and a story on the move. You don't have to memorize them. You can feel them. They map a people who know how to read a horizon line and argue gently with the sun. Camps rise and fall with the seasons like lungs. Trails stitch the Red Sea to the Levant frankincense country, to market squares where linen talks and bronze sings. Commerce is not only coin, it is trust. A caravan owes its life to accurate rumors, which well is sweet, which chief is reasonable, which stretch of sand erases tracks too easily. Ishmael's sons learn the diplomacy of distance, offer water before price. Greet elders with patience, keep a clean ledger and a clean blade. Their roads carry more than spices and resin. They carry news, marriages, songs, currencies older than currency. A rejected boy's legacy turns into a lattice of hospitality that makes deserts survivable for strangers. Prophets will later speak the names like coordinates for hope and warning. Kedar's flocks are imagined streaming toward worship, a vision thick with wool and dust, the sacred not hiding from trade, but walking through it. Armies will rattle spears toward these tents and be answered by the quiet arithmetic of survival: move, scatter, reconvene. Hide wealth in mobility, not in walls. Trust your maps. The same geography that looks empty to outsiders hums with relationships. You do not live here without friends. Frame break. Many viewers skim genealogies because they think stories end when speeches stop. But a list of names is how Scripture lays track beyond the camera. If you've ever traced your family on a web of lines and circles, therefore you know the electricity of connection. We crave plot twists. God often gives us people instead. He answers prayers with grandchildren and root knowledge with flocks that fatten winter with a neighbor. Two oases away who owes you a favor that you will politely refuse before accepting because dignity is an economy too. Consider how legacy reshapes identity. If Ishmael had stayed a single biographical side note, theology would have been free to label him and move on. Instead, his line interrupts the habit of dismissing what we don't center. When later stories mention Ishmaelites on the road with gum and balm and spices, we are overhearing a network already humming. The boy under a shrub now undergirds trade routes. The cry God heard becomes corridors people actually use. Scripture refuses to let pity be the only lens. It insists on respect. Zoom in on one prince's tent at dawn. Goats shift like dunes. A child ties a rope the way a grandfather taught him. A merchant from far west counts jars and counts character. A dispute rises and settles with a proverb that tastes like dust and wisdom. When the sun is high, the black tent breathes heat. When night drops, it's a warm constellation against another constellation. From this daily texture, poems will borrow images, prophets will borrow names, enemies will borrow trouble, and God will borrow none of it. He is already there, the one who heard the boy and followed the sound into a future of footprints. We moderns are tempted to make legacy a scoreboard. How many cities bear your name? How many paragraphs carry your quote? Desert math laughs kindly at this. Success here is measured in intact caravans and children who know which stars to trust. The princes do not rule from thrones. They adjudicate from stool height close enough to smell milk turning and leather curing. They steward roads. They remember where the last rain fell. They mark graves in their hearts because the wind persuades stone to forget too quickly. And yet the scope is large. Travel with a trader long enough, and you'll hear a proverb drift far from its source, altered by accent, but true in the mouth of a stranger. That's what legacy sounds like when it walks, not slogans, but tools. Ishmael's line carries tools, roots, knots, weather reading a posture toward strangers that keeps knives sheathed longer. This is dominion, as service a kind of royalty that refuses to be bored by the necessary. Let this part end without trumpets. Genealogies are not fireworks. They are scaffolds. If you speed past them, you'll think God only cares about main stages. If you sit inside them, you'll learn that God builds galaxies from family dinners and sand-worn maps. The princes of Ishmael are not a footnote to someone else's glory. They are an answer to someone else's fear. A mother cried in the desert. Now there are roads. Takeaway. Don't skim the lists in your life. Names are maps. Networks are miracles. Legacy is often a road other people travel safely because you kept it clear. Centuries pass, and the family story becomes a classroom. In a letter to a young church allergic to grace, Paul holds up Hagar and Sarai like two road signs. He isn't writing a genealogy update. He's fighting a spiritual drift, people rescued by Jesus now trying to earn oxygen again. Therefore, he uses allegory, a teacher's tool. Hagar stands in for a system that makes you prove you belong. Sarai stands in for a promise that makes you free before you perform. It's not about bloodlines. It's about bondage versus belonging. But allegory mishandled becomes a weapon. If you turn a metaphor about systems into a verdict on peoples, you have abandoned the text for tribalism. Paul's therefore is theological, not ethnic. He is saying, if you rebuild a ladder to God, you'll climb yourself sick. If you trust the Son, you're already home and can learn holiness as a language, not a visa requirement. Allegory serves love or it doesn't serve. Why bring Ishmael and Isaac into a church fight? Because family scenes are sticky. They don't slip off the heart. Paul knows we remember pictures better than policies. A servant mother under command, therefore a child born into obligation. A promise mother, long barren, therefore a child born into gift. He's trying to cure gospel amnesia. You did not hustle your way into the kingdom. You were carried. If you started by spirit, don't finish by spreadsheet. Frame break. Some of us flinch at this passage because it has been used to sneer at the descendants of Hagar. Let's say it plain scripture never licenses contempt for neighbors God hears. Paul's logic is pastoral. Stop enslaving yourselves to checklists that Christ fulfilled. He isn't writing an ethnic insult. He's writing a jailbreak. If your reading of Paul makes you harsher to real people, therefore your reading has missed his Lord. So what do we do with this? First, we let the allegory interrogate our habits. Are we using spiritual disciplines as oxygen masks or as trophies? Prayer and fasting are beautiful servants. They are cruel masters. Second, we let it soften our posture toward other traditions. Confidence in your covenant doesn't require contempt for your cousin. The God who heard a teenage boy under a shrub is not flustered by our debates. He is asking whether our doctrine can hold hands with our hospitality. Paul also insists on the long arc. Not all children of Abraham are children of the promise in the same sense. But God's mercy is hunting nations through the seed of one son. Therefore, identity in Christ relativizes every other badge without erasing it. Your background still matters. It just can't boss you. Freedom is not freedom from love's obligations. It is freedom to fulfill them without fear of being disowned. Modern mirror. In your church, someone wants to gate the table with extra locks. Dress like this, vote like that, memorize these, prefer those. Rules feel safer than relationship. They make belonging feel measurable. But the gospel is not a spreadsheet. It's adoption papers signed in blood you didn't shed. Therefore, holiness becomes training for a family you already share, not auditions for a part you might lose. Bring it back to Ishmael. His story teaches that God hears the rejected and builds roads out of their survival. Paul's letter teaches that God frees the religiously exhausted and builds churches out of their gratitude. Put them together, and you get a community that refuses two errors, despising outsiders and enslaving insiders. We honor the boy God heard by refusing to weaponize his mother's name. We honor the son God sent by refusing to rebuild the chains he broke. If you want a quick diagnostic for your soul, ask, do my convictions make me easier to live with or harder to survive? If your theology makes you precise but loveless, therefore it is a symbol without music. If grace makes you lax about love, therefore you've mistaken permission for transformation. The family story and the apostles' letter agree truth without triumphalism, freedom without contempt, holiness without ladders. One more picture. A dinner table after a long week. Opinions across the wood like scattered silverware. You speak carefully, you listen harder, you pass bread. Someone says something clumsy. You correct without contempt. You remember that the goal is not to win the night, but to keep the family. That's Paul's dream, a people so sure of their adoption that they can afford gentleness. Therefore the world sees peace where it expected a fight and wonders about the Father. Takeaway, read Paul. The way he wrote against slavery to performance for freedom that loves. Let your convictions produce hospitality, not contempt. If your theology can't wash feet, learn the gospel again. City morning sirens comb the air like rough hands. A shelter door rolls up. Coffee steams in paper cups. Names get called in a voice tired from mercy. In a courthouse hallway, a foster kid in a too-big polo stares at a floor that won't look back. At a border station, a mother rehearses the one sentence she knows in your language. Please, my child. In a church lobby, a man stands too long at the donut table because leaving means being alone again. We read ancient pages and think distance protects us, but the same ache walks our sidewalks in different shoes. The question, does God hear the rejected, is not a museum riddle. It is a Monday. If God hears, therefore his people move. Not because we're saviors, but because we are well-finders. We don't have to fix the desert. We have to bring skins to the ones stuck under shrubs. That looks small on camera and enormous up close. A grocery card no one has to earn with a sad story. A ride to the hearing so a teen doesn't face paperwork and fluorescent lights alone. A spare room opened with boundaries and blessing. A name remembered and spoken like a bridge. The world will ask for outcomes. The gospel asks for presence. But what about scammers, we ask? Because fear loves hypothetical villains. Prudence matters, yes. Background checks matter, yes. Boundaries are love's bones, absolutely. But if caution devours compassion, therefore we become people who can explain the crisis and ignore the person. James defines pure religion as care for orphans and widows in their distress, not in a strategic window, not when you've optimized your budget, but when need is louder than your schedule. Mercy is not naive. It is brave enough to be inconvenienced. Churches can turn hearing into programs and forget the person Hagar sized. So slow down the emotional clock. When someone shares a need, don't sprint to solutions like you're allergic to silence. Listen until the problem has a face, therefore your help can have a name. Sometimes the well is a referral and a phone call made while you're still in the room. Sometimes it's a team that returns next week, not a one-time photo op. Sometimes it's noticing the strong one who never asks for anything, and offering before dignity has to beg. Your gift will not solve systemic deserts by itself. It will keep a boy breathing until he can stand. That is not small, that is holy. Systems need reformers, people need neighbors. Be the neighbor who knows where the wells are. AA meetings at 7, the clinic that takes walk-ins on Tuesdays. The landlord who will give a second chance if you vouch with your own name. Learn the map. Teach it. Put water in other people's hands so they can lift someone you'll never meet. Frame break. If you have felt unseen, your scar can become a compass. You know what it's like to measure days by the battery level of your hope. Therefore, when you meet someone blinking in the same light, you recognize them. Do not waste that recognition. Aim it. Speak a sentence you needed once. You're not alone. I believe you. I can sit with you while we call. Compassion without action is a mirage. Action without compassion is a machine. We need both a heart that hears and hands that carry. Let's not overcomplicate obedience. Choose one Hagar, one Ishmael, one person, one family. Your household or small group can carry across the week. Pray like God hears. Move like He sent you. Celebrate tiny resurrections without despising the slowness of change. And when you are the one under the shrub, tell someone. The well is often closer than shame wants you to believe. Takeaway. Become a well finder. This week, listen for one unheard person, learn one local resource, and take one concrete step that puts real help into their hands. Mercy moves. Mashpelah waits in the cool of morning. Oaks hold their breath. The cave Abraham purchased years ago, field trees. Boundaries carefully named receives another footfall. Therefore, the promise that once walked tense now lies still. Men step aside. Women fold shawls. Two figures approach through the hush of dust, Isaac from the south, with the weight of covenant on his shoulders. Ishmael from the wilderness, with wind in his clothes and distance in his bones. The brothers do not rehearse a scene. They do not trade speeches the text forgot to print. They stand. That is the miracle. The Father who once divided lanes has reached the one bend in the road that gathers every traveler the grave, and the sons honor him by arriving without a fanfare of reasons. They work. A funeral is an inventory of verbs: lift, carry, lower, seal. Isaac kneels first, therefore Ishmael takes the other corner of the wrapped weight, as if their hands remember the shape of help before their mouths remember any words. The cave is clean rock and old story. Sarah rests here already. The first laugh of impossible joy is dust and memory. Hagar is elsewhere, God knows where, but her boy is here, shoulders square, eyes forward, giving a father back to the earth. Grief does not erase history. It refuses to weaponize it. They measure the opening check, the knots trade glances that contain more years than language. One shovel of earth sounds like thunder in a room that will not echo. Another follows quieter, as if even the soil is learning gentleness. Abraham taught them both to mark lines on land and lines on the heart. He taught Isaac to trust a promise that outruns eyesight. He taught Ishmael by letting go to trust a God who hears outside the center lane. Therefore, when they finish their work, they both step back with the honesty of men who know love is heavy and worth carrying anyway. The title deed. Abel printed in the scrolls, matters here field of Ephron measured boundaries, not because paperwork saves, but because love buys places to remember. The patriarch died as a man who believed the ground beneath his feet could host tomorrow's mercy. The sons bury him in that belief. No trumpets, no verdicts about who was more right. Just honor. Frame break. If you've ever stood in a doorway at the end of a life, you know ceremonies can tempt us to litigate old wounds. Don't. Funerals are not courtrooms. They're classrooms where you relearn the alphabet of being human: show up, carry weight, speak, softly eat after, go home in peace. Some families repair with speeches, but many heal with shared labor. Two hands on the same cord, therefore some grudges loosened by accident. Forgiveness here is not fireworks. It is courtesy without calculation, practical mercy dressed as protocol. You may never agree on the footnotes. You can still pass the bread. The cave receives its silence. Stones settle back into place as if the earth is tucking a blanket. Isaac traces the boundary in his mind, the field, the trees, because promise loves specifics. Ishmael tastes the air the way archers do and maps the road out. He is already thinking of the caravan that must move at dawn. They do not agree on everything, but they agree on this. Love honors the dead by choosing life for the living. Therefore they turn from the opening and walk toward two futures that will sketch different maps under the same sky. One will stay near altars, measuring faith by obedience on familiar ground. One will follow wells and wind, measuring faith by provision along edges. The Father of mercies is large enough to follow both. Let the last picture linger. Two sons, one grave. The story that began with distance gives you a final stubborn proximity, no speeches, only presence. You want a reunion embrace, but the text dignifies a nod. Sometimes peace is not an announcement. It is the quiet refusal to reopen wounds when duty puts your hands next to your brother's. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not a healed past, but an unpoisoned future. The God who saw a servant by a spring and heard a boy under a shrub is content with this small human closing scene. We should be too. Takeaway. Honor doesn't require agreement. When love asks for shared labor, especially at life's thresholds, show up. Carry your corner, speak gently, and let quiet faithfulness be your reconciliation.